On today's show, we're going to be talking about flexibility within your design system. What is the fine line between providing flexibility and a free for all that is useless to everyone? How strict do you have to be whilst not ending up as a design system fascist? I'm Luke Murphy, and I'm joined by my co host, Michelle Chin. We're both design advocates at zeroheight, the design system management platform, and this is Design Systems WTF. Design system fascism. I mean, I think I'm proudest of that just little choice of words there. I'm trying to avoid using the German N word in this whole podcast. But but I think this is a really interesting topic around how flexible you make your design systems, because I think it is a problem that a lot of people come up against. We had an amazing talk at Converge last year in the States from Jerry Reed, who worked at News UK on their design system. So I don't know if you know, but News UK, big sort of publishing house, they do things like the Sun and the Times and loads of newspapers and magazines in the UK. And they had a design system that served all of those websites. And she did an amazing talk that is online if you want to go see it, that is all about the challenges that they had with flexibility, which I think is pretty common, right? It's like you think you need to be, because the design system team knows best. And so you think you need to be super rigid in the components you build, um, when in reality that can kind of end up meaning that you have really bad adoption and also that your team is kind of hated within the org.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like, I think I will not name this HR software application,
Yeah.
but you can Google and maybe you'll find it. But they have a really, really nice design system and documentation site. Like, it's just like really great. You're like, oh, this has everything. This is amazing. And then you're just like, but I use this product at work because my company makes me, and you're just like, it doesn't look like the design system. Like, what happened? Like, where did things go wrong? And I think there's like twofold, which I think is also part of it's because your HR team who aren't designers are building the workflows.
Yeah.
So that's a different topic for another time of giving design control to non-designers. But I met someone who used to work at that company, and I was like, "Hey, um, you know, your design system is great. Like, it's so awesome." And he was like, "Oh yeah, it looks great, but they won't let us do anything." So even if you had like an interaction like with a modal and you wanted to, it made more sense to put the button on the left versus the right. They would ask, "Hey, can we put the button on this one time on the left because it makes more sense?" And they would be like, "No, like we said, it has to go on the right. So you must put it on the right." So it led to a lot of bad interactions. And
Yeah.
it was just like, oh, interesting, right? Like, so I think there's like, that's the danger that you can have.
It's the
Um,
ivory tower design system. Like it's the dread. It's what, yeah, it's the dreaded giving design control to non-designers. That's, I mean, that is a great topic that we should definitely cover at some point.
Writing it down.
Um, but I think that's the thing, is that that is ultimately the whole point of your design system. If you think of your design system as a product, which we've gone into that in the past, but that's okay. That just means if you don't know what we're talking about, you can go back and listen to previous episodes as to why that is a very loaded statement. But if you treat your design system as a product, if you have a product that nobody enjoys using or nobody uses because it doesn't fulfill their needs, that is a product that is going to fail. So I think that, like, that is generally what underpins a lot of this, right? And it's the fact that actually, if I'm trying to think of like I'm sure that if you had a hammer that was, no, that's a crap analogy. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a good analogy here, but it's basically like you need to listen to your users when you're building any kind of product, right? That is, with the lack of analogy, that is what it boils down to. If you're not listening to your users, then they're not going to use what you do, and you are going to fail as the team behind that product. Like, that is just the reality of the situation. And part of that, I think, does come down to flexibility. Because yes, you folks are probably the experts when it comes to making accessible components. And making them available to people, and the things that go behind it. But if you haven't got people to like buy into the use of those, because I don't know, it's either like two things. Like it's either that the end user, the designer or the developer who's trying to implement that component, either it's not fit for purpose, it's not satisfying their purpose, or it's that they think it doesn't satisfy their purpose and it should, but you haven't communicated effectively why it should be
Yeah.
fit for purpose. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I think that one of those things could be a flexibility issue.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the latter of like maybe you're not explaining things as well, it kind of goes back to the last episode where it's like you set some expectations as to like what can become a component and how things can be components, right? But yeah, I think there's also it's hard to be everywhere all at once, right? So as a centralized design system, you don't know the ins and outs of the product. So you might not know all the pain points that the end users of the actual product are having that the designers are having to solve for.
Yeah.
So it's always nice to get that feedback in that context. Doesn't mean that it has to enter the design system. Like a lot of times I'm like, yeah, like if this is experimental, try it in your product. And if it does really well and if other people can use it, like we can add it in. I think you get more of a like for federated and grassroots approach design systems, there's probably a lot more flexibility because there's a lot more empathy kind of coming around, right? Like it's like we all
People don't have
understand
the
that.
time. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's when you are time poor like that, I think that you do end up just having a lot more flexibility baked into it, unless you've got a uh, design system fascist who's like centrally controlling it, which is I think is it can happen. It's not unheard of where you've got because usually and I think I'm being a bit mean by calling them a fascist, but it's sometimes you do have that champion, right? You've got that individual champion who's really passionate about the design system and knows a lot about it. And they're probably it's like it is a like if they're a T-shaped designer, a design system might be part of that T that they're like an expert in.
And
Um, and I think that but that can also mean that those people fall into a trap where they think that what they say is more important than what anybody else
well,
says.
it's interesting because like I think this is also a thing for some designers is like a lot of people and this I feel like this is like I don't know, like a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm losing my agency and control as a designer because I have to follow using all these components and Lego
Mm,
blocks. I don't get to innovate." And so it's like I actually wonder if anyone who is like that centralized controlling person is like seeing that as their sense of identity of like I'm creating the visual language and identity for these products, right? So it's very close to like their own ego, because
yeah.
otherwise you're just kind of you know designers kind of stacking Lego blocks. um so I think that's the I wonder if there's a little bit of that. um
I think there's the I think the other one that is relatively common and can like a trap that people can fall into is when it's going back a few episodes, contractor built or agency built design systems, where it's almost like the other way in terms of like there's not enough knowledge of they're not close enough to what those people are doing or haven't had enough time to like get the requirements properly and actually build. And so I don't know, it's definitely what I've found in the past with like agency built design systems that I've had to deal with is like sometimes they can be a bit too rigid by accident because they're just building what they see as like the best example of what that is. I
yeah,
think
and
it's
I think
gone.
oh, like I think if you were to engage an agency, like I think maybe it would be nice at the start of the engagement to be like, hey, we're probably going to have some need for flexibility. Like, what can that
Mm,
look like within the work that you're going to put together to help it scale, right? So,
yeah.
I did want to jump in because Jenny asked a question about can you talk more about federated versus grassroots versus centralized? So, a centralized design system is when you have a core team that just works on the design system and shares out the components to the other teams to consume them.
Yeah.
A federated team is where there is no centralized design. Like everyone kind of, and all the different products are representatives of the products that make the design system, and they all agree kind of together how, like, what should be a component. Um, so there's no centralized like brain, but they kind of act as like a general council, like a guild. And then grassroots, a lot of times design systems will kind of start out of necessity. So like if you're
Mm,
using Figma, you're like, you know what, we need a library. I'm just gonna work with this other designer. We're gonna put something together to make our like workflows and you process more easy, right? Like more flexible and more efficient. So those are the three different types.
yeah, I think
Or there's also
grassroots
hybrid.
is. Yeah, and that's the thing. You can, I think a lot of organizations have a hybrid, centralized, federated. So you'll have a small centralized team, but you'll also have like federated nodes around the company in different product teams who are like representatives that kind of are the conduit for the design system into the product teams. Which it seems to me like hybrid is the most popular approach. Well, actually, you've got the data, Michelle.
Yes.
So
Let me tell you what I learned. So we in how we document, we asked, what your governance model was, centralized, hybrid, federated, and we kind of also split out the data by age. So like a lot or age of your design system or
Mm,
size of your design system or organization. And it's interesting. So I think a lot of times what we found out is that people will either start off federated and then or centralized and then after a couple of years, I don't remember exactly when, but like probably around like 3 or 4 years, they switched to a federated or a hybrid model, right? So it's kind of like the best of both
mm.
worlds. And I wonder if that's kind of like, you just get on your feet and then realize that you need to kind of meet in the middle, right?
Yeah. I want to change the topic, not completely, but to go back a little bit because there is something that I wanted to bring up before we get into the user questions, and they're already coming thick and fast. So I'm very excited about the user questions. But I just wanted to put this topic out there. Also, just to uh, caveat this and disclaimer this: this is not my idea. This is 100% Amy Hupe's idea. I'm saying it because she's accused me of stealing her shit in the past, and I don't want to be accused again. But we were having a great conversation the other day around this whole like flexibility issue, and we were talking about it yesterday as well. And I think that one of the great ideas that she was coming out with was the fact that she actually thinks that we need to get away from components. And I think that this is a really interesting space with flexibility in mind, is that her argument is screw the components or let the components kind of like start to build organically after you've sorted your core base. So which makes sense. So your brand stuff, so your colors, typography, everything that can kind of be tokenized, um, and your patterns. So like the very top level. Um, and then from there, you start to just build your components as you're building stuff, or if you've already got a product, you start to prioritize and identify what the most popular ones are and start to like standardize your components that way. I thought it was an interesting approach that I think speaks to the whole like flexibility need that I'm really excited to see. I know she's got a talk in the works around this, and so I'm really excited about that. But anyway, I just wanted to like put that out there as a concept. So I thought it'd spark some good ideas and debates.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pro patterns.
Oh,
Um,
patterns are the best.
yeah, like I think because I think about it, like I talk to a lot of design system we talk to a lot of design system teams and they're all like fussing about their buttons and their component libraries. And it's just like, how many designers in the world do we need to make a button that we all know like what it should look like and what it should
Buttons are
do?
boring. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we can only do so much, right? Like where the
Yeah.
value of a designer comes in is like those interactions, right? Like the workflow, like that's the identity of your product. Like how do you walk someone through a task to complete? What does that look like, right? It's all pattern based. And that's kind of like where as a former manager of designers, that's where I want to push my designers because I know they can make a button. Like I don't need them to
Yeah.
continue their career of making buttons. I want them to grow and push themselves, right? So I think patterns is like actually like where we need to go back to, right? Because like patterns
Yeah.
before atomic design, there was pattern libraries, right? So I think we're kind of coming full circle again of like we
Yeah.
need to get back to patterns. Like, yeah.
Well, and it is, and I love for those who don't know sort of the difference between a pattern and a component. Well, actually, I don't want to even tackle that one. How would you define a pattern in comparison to a component?
Um I wrote an article on this, so I have a ready definition. But a
Oh, there we go.
component is very like specific colors, size, style, everything is very defined, not a
Yeah,
lot of flexibility. Patterns, and there's different levels of patterns. You can have more flexibility to meet your situation.
yeah,
So it could be like an empty state that's in a blank dashboard or in a blank space in a dashboard. So like much smaller. So there's flexibility based on the situation. There could be some actual prescriptive elements. So like, use this font, use these headings or what have you. But there's a lot of flexibility in like, do you use an illustration or not? Um, do you have a title? What is the call to action? Like that type of stuff.
yeah,
And I think there's also screen patterns and also workflow patterns, right? So like
yeah,
the whole login flow process is a pattern, but like a table in a page or something like that, that could be like a screen pattern.
yeah.
Um,
I think if you want, so we can just transition really nicely into the user questions here. Um, so Kelly H has asked for a reference for what we think is a well documented pattern. I know I've got one that I mean this is the gold standard. I feel like this design system is one of the gold standards for the world. But Gov UK actually have a really nice collection of patterns. And you can see there. So if you go to design-system.service.gov.uk or you just look up gov.uk patterns on your favorite search engine, you should be able to find it there. They have a whole load of from things like confirmation pages, question pages, step-by-step navigation, to like very specific small patterns like asking somebody for their gender or sex, because it's a very nuanced thing. So it's not just a component; it has patterns behind it. Um, and I think I mean, they're very good at documenting. So I think they're a really good like gold star standard. Do you have any good examples?
I think it was like the BBC has patterns, but it's interesting because I think when I last looked at it, it was like the patterns were from like maybe even 10 plus years ago,
Yeah,
which I think is nice because it shows
yeah,
you like patterns have longevity, right? Like
yeah.
they're they're gonna remain relevant, for a long time. So just because it seems like it's old doesn't mean that it's outdated. It's just very seasoned and very proven.
I was gonna
Um,
say, if anybody wants examples of a really good, now I'm trying to find the buddy, um, the book title. So this is going to be fun for the podcast edit. But if anybody wants some very old examples of good patterns, there is an amazing book called A Pattern Language, by Christopher Alexander, Murray Silverstein, and Sarah Ishikawa, which is one of the nerdiest, best design systems books from I think 60s or 70s, that like I think informed a lot of how we view what design systems are. And basically it's around like architectural, town planning, and like social space patterns.
oh,
um but really great example of like that concept of what a pattern is, because it's not a prescriptive guideline. It is a concept or idea that is like how you achieve something with all of the considerations and thoughts that go into it.
yeah, that's really cool. I want to check that out. And I think everyone is like probably like listening to us and Googling. I'm collecting a list of resources and we'll put that with the episode. So you'll
Yeah.
have that if you want to not Google. But I think the pattern thing is cool because it's interesting. IBM's Carbon Design, they started a new way of I guess, existing. So it's
Yeah, I
called
saw
like
this.
Carbon Platform. If you go to
Yeah.
like next.carbondesignSystem.com, you'll see it. And so basically it's like your core components, but there's a lot of flexibility. So they want it because IBM's so huge, so many products, so many things. It's hard to kind of corral all that. They've really opened it up so you have the guidance to use. I looked at it this morning. It didn't look as built out, but like I think it does have patterns in it, but they plan to do a lot more with it. So basically, you can kind of look through their library of ideas and build what you need, which I think is really great. But I think IBM at that scale totally makes sense. But I've also talked to some design system designers who are like, I feel like they're trying to pass the buck. They're like, can I just make my design system really flexible? And I'm like, I think you don't want to do the work. Because yeah, it is
No.
hard. It is
Yeah.
hard, right? Like, but I think I was like, you're trying to create a unified look and feel. And
Yeah.
the team and the products aren't ready for that amount of flexibility, right? Like, yeah, at some point, sure.
But yeah, I think that's the thing. It's like the it's like the it's like the need. I can't remember if I brought this up in a previous podcast or not. It's like the need for like 100% test coverage from engineering, where it's like, oh, what a great ideal. It's like, yes, having a super tested, like super backed up design system that suits every need and every use case, sure, that's ideal. It's not very realistic though, is it?
Yeah.
So, so actually, there's transitioning into what might be our last question. We might have time for two. Kelly actually has another great question, which is, do we have any examples for like drawing the line between being flexible and being more rigid? Um, I do actually think, and if we take it back to like a component level here, because I know that a lot of people still like components. I actually think going back and looking at that talk that I mentioned from Jerry Reed, which is about, I'm trying to remember the title. It was like when your design system grows
Grows
up,
up and gets its
moves
own
out, and
apartment.
gets its own.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Um, she had a great example in there of it where they had built what was basically an audio player for all the different platforms, and so it was themable, so it could theme on the different things. But what they saw very quickly was the fact that the usage of it was just super low. And when they reached out to the different teams to see why, it was because there were slightly different needs and use cases for every single version of the audio player, which is probably like might be a larger problem that needs to be addressed at some point, which is what we, come back to around that whole, well, yeah, ideally that wouldn't be an issue, but the reality is that it is. Um, and so they spent quite a lot of time like going back and working on this single component. And what they realized is they realized actually, when we think about it, when we look at the use cases and why we want to enforce the use of this as a design system component, as opposed to a like a component that is what's the term that we use? Like an orphan component that all
Oh,
the products
detached?
detached. It's kind of detached, but it's basically that the product teams themselves will create. Um, they were like, actually, when it boils down to it, there are only a few things within that chunky component that they really care about the usability of, and they really care about the accessibility of. And so what they ended up doing was breaking it down. And this kind of, if you take it back to your atomic principles, um, it's like actually flexibility a lot of the time when it comes to like component level flexibility, if we're talking there, it is maybe just accepting that you only build up the atoms and the molecules and you stop there, and you stop before you get to organisms, or you only build the atoms and you don't build the molecules, and you basically say, okay, what are the things we care about, and we want to make sure that they're consistent and the experience is consistent, and then start from there, and then sort of see. And it's probably like a little bit of a game of like going back and forth, but seeing at which point it breaks. So I think is a nice way to do it.
Yeah, I think it depends on like where your products are at, where your teams are at, like to see how much flexibility you put in. I think the other thing is like design systems take a really long time to make. So it's not like hell can we hurry up and get this aligned, in the next sprint. It's like at some point, and some point might be 6 months to a year, like, that it takes to get that component in or to build the flexibility, like, it just and business and your products can't stop, right? So,
Yeah.
they have to keep moving, for sure. I think that's the thing is, like, I think and it's weird, in this high-tech, fast-paced world, like, we're always rushing, but, like, design systems are just gonna take years is what I'm
They are.
realizing,
And I
like
think that it's like when it comes down to it as well. I was talking to when Amy and I were talking about the whole patterns and base thing. We were talking about this in I love this concept. Have you heard of this concept of pace layers?
yeah.
Um it's so the idea is that it's society works at pace layers, and it's like different thing you have these like build up of layers in like concentric circles, and the further you go from the core, the faster it moves. And so you have things like um what was it? It was like the examples of things like fashion and taste and all of that kind of stuff. And that's on like the outer layer of your pace layer. And then it's like a little bit further in and things like beliefs, and it sort of like goes down to the things that take a really long time. And so the central circle takes a really long time to change. Um, and it's almost like we should be seeing our design systems like this too, where it's like we actually there are some things that should be lower down those pace layers, and they are probably your patterns and your patterns in your base are probably the things that shouldn't change that often. And then it's like your components are further out. Or maybe the patterns can change. I don't know. It's I think it's like an interesting concept of like we should be looking at that. Oh, do we have time for one last question, even though we're already over time?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Because I thought that Justin had a good question here. Last question of the episode. When you have extremely robust and flexible component systems, from a technical point of view, how do you determine how much of it to communicate in your documentation, say on Zero Height, um, to the folks that don't use Figma, or I'm guessing even in this case, like don't use the code, aren't directly interacting with the code? Um, I thought this was a really interesting question because it is kind of it goes into that whole like um I don't know. I see this a lot when like folks build out their components in Figma and they are like endlessly complex. um and then it's like how much of that complexity do you surface? I think the answer is pretty easy. I don't know if you do.
I don't know. I'm curious to hear your answer.
Um I think I don't know if it's a particularly exciting answer, but I think you only need to I think that this should be a blanket sort of statement across everything that you're doing. You should only be surfacing the complexity if you think that that person needs to understand the complexity. It's like if it's going to sell it into them, if it's going to help them to um, buy into the concept of it and use it, then it's like. But basically, I strongly believe in hiding complexity, and that's coming from somebody who grew up, in the days where we used to take apart our computers to understand how they work. I kind of like hidden complexity when I don't need to, but maybe that's just me getting old and not wanting to complicate my life any further.
I mean, think of all the information we all have to take in, right? Like
Exactly.
and you're always having to constantly filter like what's important, what's not. So I would think from that perspective, like, is it really important? Like, what information is really important for someone to move forward with? Because in ChatGPT, like when you ask to document components, it'll be like, oh, and use this blue. And it's like, well, we already decided that this button was only going to be blue. We don't need to like reiterate that and add to
Yeah.
like the cognitive overload.
Exactly. I think that's it. It's basically like we should be thinking about the cognitive load. Like we think about the cognitive load when we build our products, right? When we think of things like how much copy we put on the screen, how uh thoughtless is not the right word, but how frictionless it is as an
Yeah.
experience, right? Um, except for when you need friction. And I think that that's like a really important thing when we're, and actually, I think that, if we were going to use an example of somebody who might have erred on the other side of this, I think Gov UK is probably one of those where they have so much information in their documentation. And I know that they're constantly like finding that balance, but because they're a government organization, they're like erring on the side of too much information. But it's one of those things where I think that actually think about the cognitive load of your users. Think about the fact that you're trying to make their lives easier, not harder. So maybe, don't write essays and don't include every single permutation you can think of. That's just for us, um, sadists and masochists. So which is, I think, a good point to end the show on, right?
I think so.
Uh, so that's it for today. If you got any questions or you want to fire across at us, or if you've got any suggestions for the next episode, then please send them through. You can either do that via the Zero Slack community, which you can join at zeroheight.com/Slack, or you can get in touch with us on X at zeroheight. Still hate calling it X. Or you can email us at community@zeroheight.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. I think you've got a special guest on in place of me next time, don't you? Is that next time?
I don't know if I guess it is next time.
I've
Yes.
got no idea in terms of
What is
time.
time? We're
What is
at the
time?
end of January.
We're at the end of
Um,
January. But
but
anyway, it's going to be a good one. So make sure that you tune in 2 weeks' time. See you next time.